Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a really special treat for you guys. We're doing a show on the resurrection of Jesus and the evidence for and against that. And I have a few special guests here for you. So the first place, we have Dr. Mike Lacona. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Dale.
Welcome back. I think it's been a couple of years since you've been on the show last time.
Yeah, good to be with you again.
Awesome. And I'm also joined by a couple other special guests to sort of help me co-host and give their own take on the resurrection. So we have someone who's been on the show before, Robert L. White. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Dale. It's great to be back on.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you were back about a year ago. You were talking about miracles and that sort of thing.
Right.
And we also have somebody who's new to the show, and I wanted to bring him on because he shared with me his new book on the resurrection. I thought it was great. Caleb Jackson. Hey, Caleb.
Hi, Dale.
Awesome. So yeah, without further ado, I think the first thing I want to do is just spend a few minutes sort of introducing us to who each of you are. So, in your own words and that sort of thing. So, Mike, you want to give the audience sort of an introduction again as to who you are and that?
Sure. Well, I am associate professor of theology at Houston Baptist University, Happening Baptist University, the best apologetics program for a master's degree in the world. And I'm also president of a nonprofit organization, Risen Jesus, Inc. My topics of interest are the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, the historical reliability of the Gospels, and more recently, gospel differences. I've written on gospel differences and the resurrection of Jesus, and I have a YouTube channel. Just type in Mike Lacona and you can go there, and we have a website, risenjesus.com.
Awesome. All right. And Robert, just going in the same order, just spend a couple minutes to reintroduce the audience as to who you are there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a Christian with an interest in philosophy, especially epistemology. I geek out on. There's so much raw data about there, and so many YouTube debates we've already had. William Lane Craig, you, Mike Lacona. I just watched your Richard Carrier one of your Richard Carrier ones yesterday, which is great. Actually, I really enjoyed it. And also Matt Dillahunty, and I love all that stuff, but things get very messy in conversation. And so I've become almost someone who's really interested in some of the meta topics. And actually I like John Loftus's like outsider test for faith sort of stuff, because it's like, okay, this is interesting. Like we have these differences and we've talked about this stuff for years, especially people who are already familiar with these topics. And just even the resurrection is a great example of this, where people mix at least two different things at a time. One is like, is this, if the resurrection of Jesus is a live option, is that the best explanation? That gets mixed with, is there a God, or miracles are even possible? And so conversations get so confused. And I even noticed this some with your chat, Mike, with Laura Robinson, I believe. And I think sometimes her concerns about using history as a foundation ended up intermingling with discussing if the resurrection is a good historical answer. And those are great questions. Like I sympathize with Laura and skeptics about miracles, but all of a sudden you find yourself talking about the Kalam cosmological argument when you started talking about Josephus, and it's just like, how is anyone going to get anything out of this? So I really geek out on the figuring out, okay, what are we actually trying to say here? What is the actual disagreement? And trying to kind of keep things tidy to figure out if the resurrection is a live option, is it the best explanation? That is fascinating to me. And I would love to see skeptics get to a point where they maybe see that a little bit more. And they're like, if it's a live option, let's grant that for a second. Wait, there's actually something to this. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I come in on this.
Awesome. All right. And last but not least, Caleb, do you want to just give sort of a couple minute introduction as to who you are and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so right now I'm a student at Indiana University, but on the side, I just do apologetics as a topic that I think is really interesting. And being in colleges has just helped me develop research skills generally. So I wanted to apply that to interests like theology and apologetics and so forth. And so, yeah, as Dale mentioned earlier, I do have a self-published book on the resurrection, Undead, a historical investigation to the most famous miracle in history, which is on Amazon. Kindle and paperback. But yeah, so I just really was interested in the topic of the resurrection, and I was writing this at a time where I was doubting and really curious on the scholarship. And I liked all of the books on the topic, Mike's included, but I wanted to kind of combine them all together and take the best arguments from each one. So you'll see me here talking about the empty tomb, the appearances, and more like N.T. Wright style arguments for the origin of the resurrection belief, going through all the objections and talking about miracles in the last chapter and medically documented cases we have of those. And so, yeah, it's just always been an intriguing topic, and I think it is the pinnacle of the Christian faith. And while I don't necessarily know, I would say that it proves the Christian faith, it certainly makes it more believable and definitely helps it out in terms of probability.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that sort of leads into the first main topic. Both you and Robert mentioned the issue of miracles and how we can assess that as historians and that sort of thing. So yeah, Mike, I want to turn it straight to you as the main special guest here. And what is your sort of take on how does the historian relate to miracles in general, and what sort of standard of proof should be used when we're assessing that kind of thing?
Well, the question deals a lot with worldview, of course. If you're an atheist, you tend to reject reports of miracles and don't think they're even possible, right? Because it's your worldview. If you're a Christian or a theist of some sort, then you think that miracles occurred and you think that they are possible. At least you think they can be investigated, right? So when it comes to the historian, I think we have to do our best to bracket our worldview. Because if you have a miracle that can be established to have occurred, well, then that overturns certain worldviews, such as atheism and deism. So it could be the very thing you're investigating that shows that your worldview is mistaken, and you have to re-examine your worldview. So it's wise to bracket your worldview while the investigation proceeds and let the data speak for themselves. Otherwise, you place yourself in a dangerous position where you are guided more by your worldview than you are the data. And the danger in that is manifest. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. So I think when we approach this matter of the resurrection or investigating miracles, we have to bracket our worldview if we're going to do this investigation responsibly. Now, if a miracle has occurred, and it depends how you define miracle, I'm going to define it. I mean, we can get into it, and there's so many different definitions, but let's just say it is a supernatural event for which there was no conceivable natural cause. Now, I think if you pray and God answers that prayer, even though it could be coincidence, that's still a miracle, but you can't identify it as a miracle. It'd be impossible. So I'm talking about not only the definition of a miracle here, but also being able to identify it as a miracle. So I would say that it is a supernatural event for which no natural cause is possible, or that a natural cause is extraordinarily unlikely. Now, I think if such an event occurred, a miracle occurred, if it actually occurred, then a historian should be able to adjudicate on the matter. I don't see any reason why they couldn't. They could say there's enough evidence to support the conclusion that this miracle occurred, or there's enough evidence to support that it did not occur. There's enough evidence to say that it didn't, or it may have, we just don't have enough evidence, and so we just, leave the question unanswered. A historian, as a historian, does not have the tools to determine that God performed this particular act. I mean, what tool might a historian have that would say, even if the event occurred, that it was God that, let's say, raised Jesus, rather than a supernatural entity like an alien in a parallel universe somewhere with these amazing powers, and was doing his PhD project. And in order to get his PhD, he had to deceive an entire civilization to believe that a mere human was divine and had raised from the dead. So he did this in order to get his doctorate. there's no way that a historian has a tool to be able to adjudicate between those two. Now, of course, you could look and say, well, the second with aliens is ad hoc, and we do have evidence for God's existence. But then you could say, well, how do you know it wasn't Satan? Even within a Christian view, if the Christian view of Satan is correct, how do you know it wasn't Satan just deceiving people? And maybe Islam is true, or something like that. So I don't think that a historian has the tools to say that it was God who raised Jesus or God who performed this miracle. I think that a theologian or philosopher could or historian in their off hours could make such a decision and say, well, this is what I believe. But the historian has no tools to make that decision, to say that it was God who performed this miracle. But I don't see any reason why a historian, as historian, cannot adjudicate on a miracle claim to say that it occurred, it did not occur, or it's just simply not, there's simply not enough data to confirm either way.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah. And I'll just say, to confirm what you were saying there, believe it or not, Shabir Ali used that line on me too. When I gave him the evidence from the Shroud and the resurrection, he said, well, Satan did that or something. So, all right, cool. So just sort of following up, Caleb, I'll start with you. Do you have any sort of quick follow-up questions or comments about your take on this issue of the possibility of miracles?
Well, just to comment real fast on what Mike said, I think that's a good point, because I believe it's Deuteronomy 13, where it's like, if a false prophet performs a miracle in front of you and tells you to worship another god, you shouldn't believe him. And I know Celsus, who was, as we know, the Greek opponent of Christianity in the 2nd century, was like, why do you believe it was Jesus, or why do you believe God raised Jesus and not Satan to deceive you? So I think those are legitimate points. In terms of miracles in general, I think to say that they can't be confirmed historically is just a watchword, or a catchphrase. But realistically, you can't repeat a miracle, so I don't think you can do it scientifically. I think something that happens only once is, by definition, a historical method. So I don't know what other method you would use besides history to look at miracles. And the idea that they're improbable, it begs the question that it's never happened before, right? I mean, miracle claims are very common in the world. It's just whether or not you think they should be taken seriously or not, but you can't dismiss them without further investigating them. There was one study that actually said that 55% of American doctors believe they have seen a miracle. So, I mean, that's quite a lot of people, and a lot of educated people. David Hume said that miracles are only witnessed by savages who aren't educated, but I think that clearly refutes that. And there's also even atheists. I forget her name. I think Duffin did a whole study on Catholic healing miracles from the Vatican, and she ended up believing in miracles despite being an atheist. I think she still is an atheist, but she thought it was very compelling and that there is medical evidence out there. So I think if one looks at the data, it's very compelling.
Excellent. All right. And what about you, Robert? Do you have any sort of follow-up questions or comments about this particular issue? Oh, you're muted. That helps to unmute. But
Yeah, classic Zoom mistake of very 2020, be muted on Zoom. No, I definitely agree with what Mike was saying. The stuff like the line of thinking I have, and not to harp on it, but this is what I care about, is not allowing the conversation to be dominated by wondering if miracles are even possible, so that we don't talk about evidence. I don't want theological and philosophical considerations to do violence to the data. And I wanted to share something with you guys that I think you'll find really interesting if you didn't know this. I'm currently reading through, very slowly, Newton's Principia, the most famous science textbook ever. And it's half of the book is actually a guide with it, like a commentary. And I just finished the guide and I'm getting into the Principia itself. But this blew me away. Newton had to go to extreme lengths when he laid out universal gravitation to avoid the charge of occultism. I don't think most people know this. And it's because anything that was action at a distance was seen as occult behavior, because there's no mechanism. You're basically saying magic, gravity, is causing Jupiter to go around the sun rather than some sort of ether that is in contact, like with Jupiter. And so he had to go to the extreme and just be very careful in his mathematical approach to make it based in math and say, this is simply the laws these things are behaving by. And this is where he said his famous, I make no hypotheses, because he's saying, look, I'm not trying to claim what is causing this. I'm just saying it's happening. And it was funny. I realized that's exactly what I want to do with the resurrection and with miracles. Skeptics and opponents want to bring in, they want to ask, well, what do you think the mechanism is? How does God actually do it or whatever? And it's like, well, first we need to know what the data is. First, we just have to know what the data is. Did the disciples think they saw Jesus or not? And then that question I actually really like, because there's consensus on it. It's like, okay, we can actually agree on that. Now we all know a little bit more about history in the world, that the disciples thought they saw Jesus. Then we can start to talk about miracles or whatever. So my biggest concern is I don't want theology and philosophy to do violence to the data. You can be a consistent skeptic and accept the data and say, I still don't believe because of my philosophy. And that might be valid and logical, but don't do violence to the data because of your philosophy. So that's what I care about.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. And just very quickly, because I know that we're limited on time. So I want to share something quickly, my take, because I think that the prior probability is, hopefully, is that coming up for everyone, the slide?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I think that the prior probability is it's inscrutable, and it is worldview dependent. Does God exist? And it involves factors of divine psychology. So something that I find helpful is understanding the Jeffrey conditionalization formula. And typically skeptics focus on this second part, right? They want to say, well, it's so improbable to occur, given the resurrection, given our basic background knowledge, and God doesn't exist. Of course, that's improbable. This is virtually zero, but they forget to add the fact that, well, what's the prior probability given God exists? And that's where we need to factor in his divine psychology and that sort of thing. So there's a difference in the reference classes. They're looking at just what's the prior probability that God would raise a random person for no reason at all. Obviously, that's virtually zero. But the proper reference class is, well, what's the prior probability God would want to raise Jesus, given he had a sufficient reason for doing so? And obviously that's a religious reason in Jesus' case. So yeah, I just wanted to say that the proper thing, you've got to have this full understanding to get the proper prior probability. So yeah, that's it for my take there. So let's move on to the next topic. Out of curiosity, Mike, can you still hear me? Because you look frozen.
No, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So your video's frozen. So
But by the way, I just want to say that what you just showed with Bayes' theorem, most historians would eschew the use of Bayes' theorem in their investigation, and I think for good reason, because a large part of calculating the probability of Jesus being raised from the dead using Bayes' theorem is the prior probability. So how would you calculate the prior probability of the resurrection? I think that's inscrutable. It's like, and it's the same way with most historical events. I mean, it's easy in some cases, like with the lottery. If someone says, if someone claims that they won the lottery, it's easy to calculate the prior probability that their testimony is true. You'd say, well, I mean, it's different for every state, but let's just say it's 1 chance in 300 million. Well, that's the prior probability that person won if they played with 1 ticket. If they bought 2 tickets, well, then it'd be the prior probability would be 1 chance in 150 million, right? So, but when it comes to historical events, it's very difficult to look at the prior probability. So, for example, something as simple as the U.S. dropping nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II. What's the prior probability that they would do that? Well, how do you calculate that? You would have to look at the external evidence for it, not the prior probability. There's just very difficult to put into a reference class. Same thing with science. What's the prior probability of black holes? I mean, how do you calculate that? Because black holes are theoretical entities posited to explain observable phenomena. We've never seen a black hole, probably never will, according to John Polkinghorne. So if it's a theoretical entity posited to explain observable phenomena, there it is. It's based on evidence that we have, but it's very difficult, impossible to calculate a prior probability of black holes. Same thing with something like a miracle or the resurrection. What's the prior probability of Jesus rising from the dead? You can't calculate that. You would have to know ahead of time that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, and that is outside the scope of the historian. So I just think that such is inscrutable, and that's why most historians, almost all of them, eschew the use of Bayes' theorem in their historical investigation.
Yeah.
Quick question on that. Wouldn't you say that Bayes' theorem, though, and this came up during the Richard Carey debate, Bayes' theorem is sort of a mathematical version of abductive reasoning, of inference to the best explanation? You're plugging in specific numbers, which I see why you're complaining about that. But like, I know you do like abductive reasoning, the inference to the best explanation. Like that is the
Sure.
proper historical way.
Yeah,
right?
and I think you could do something like part of the posterior probability that, or likelihood that is calculated within Bayes' theorems to say, given the truth of the hypothesis, the evidence, given the truth of the hypothesis, what do we expect? Well, we would call that explanatory power. So you've got certain elements of Bayes' theorem that we use in arguments of inference to the best explanation. But perhaps the main element in Bayes' theorem, the prior probability, is something you can't calculate. And so I think Bayes' theorem, you have an incomplete use of it within historical investigation. And then if you want to look at the prior probability, most of what you're going to come up with is a subjective answer. Now, if you want to incorporate philosophy and natural theology and all that in arguments for God's existence, then you're free to do that with Bayes' theorem, of course. But don't call it a historical argument. It's a hybrid of history, science, philosophy, whatever you may. But if you're going to approach this purely as a historian, Bayes' theorem just is not a tool you're going to want to use.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I fully agree with what you guys are saying in terms of Mike's word that this prior probability factor is inscrutable. This is why I think that skeptics utterly fail when they say, no, we can prove it's improbable. Well, it incorporates elements of divine psychology. You can't do that, let alone as a historian. You can't adjudicate on those and assign actual objective values and that sort of thing. So yeah, I fully agree with what you guys are saying. I just sort of wanted to get people to understand that it's not as simple as just saying, well, billions of people don't rise from the dead, so therefore it's improbable. All right, cool.
Right.
But I want to be clear. I'm not saying it's illegitimate to use Bayes. It is for a historian. A historian just can't look at that as a historian and use Bayes' theorem. But if an apologist, a philosopher, a theologian wants to do it, incorporate arguments from other disciplines, well, then they are free to do so, right? I'm just approaching it as a historian. I'm not saying the other approaches are illegitimate. I'm just saying I wouldn't do that as a historian and argue here's the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I just want to be clear on that.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, that actually does speak to the fact of methodology. And I know that there are different methods that Christian apologists use to study the resurrection. So Mike, do you just want to maybe spend a few minutes to introduce, like, what is your approach to studying the resurrection?
Well, I think there's a number of legitimate approaches that one can use. For me, I just became really interested in the philosophy of history, historical method, and I wanted to see that if I bracketed my worldview and just looked at it using historical method, applied historical methodology, what would it look like to investigate the resurrection of Jesus as a historian? And so that's what really interested me. So I did study the philosophy of history, historical method. Had a lot of fun doing so. I mean, there are philosophers of history who devote their entire careers to studying these things. Epistemology, when it comes to understanding how we verify a historical event and to what degree can we do it. I mean, it's really fascinating. I thought to myself, I could really get locked into this. I could spend a career just looking at this and how we arrive at historical knowledge, but I didn't want to get bogged down on that. I thought there were more important missions for me in life than to do that. Although that would have been interesting and important, I just wanted to move on to some other things. But that's what really interests me: historical method, and just coming at it from the lens of a historian. I'm not saying the other methods are illegitimate, but I wanted to see. My interest is just purely historical in nature.
That is just as a quick follow-up, if you don't mind me asking before I get to the other two, but so there's the minimal facts approach versus maximal facts approach and that sort of thing. So do you want to speak to that? Like that?
Yeah, I think the maximal approach is fine. I do think that, the more that you add to it, I like Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach, because you're only dealing with those facts that are so strongly supported by the data that even the majority of skeptical or non-believing scholars are willing to grant them as facts. That doesn't mean they're true because skeptics do it, but let's face it, we all have our own biases. We all have our own lens through which we view the world and view data. And sometimes our biases, whether we're a Christian or an agnostic or an atheist, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, it's going to cloud our reasoning. And if we want to have one of the things that we can do to kind of wipe our lens so that we can look at it through more clearly, is to see, okay, well, what are some other things that people agree on that don't have the same worldview as I do? Do they grant it? If they grant it, they may do it for the same reason or different reasons. But if an atheist is granting that Jesus, say, died by crucifixion, well, then, I can look and say, well, these arguments are probably, I'm accepting these because, well, the data is that good. So the more, when I'm having a discussion with a non-believer and I bring up, let's say, the minimal facts and can base an argument for the resurrection based on the minimal facts, well, they're usually going to accept those facts. So it's just a matter of the method then, and how am I arriving at that conclusion? And it, for practical purposes, it really streamlines things. Now, the more data that I add in there, so like, for example, if I'm going to bring in accounts from the Gospels, I believe the Gospels are reliable. However, if I bring them in, I also bring in more controversy, more topics for debate, such as, well, the traditional authorship of the Gospels. What about the things that we can verify? What about the biases of the Gospel authors? Is there legend and myth and error in the Gospels, and all kinds of other issues I bring into the discussion as soon as I bring those in. So it's like if I'm doing a trial, a defense. If I'm on trial and my defense lawyer, if he sees that defense lawyer, he or she may make a decision on whether they're going to put me on the stand on the possible things that the prosecutor may bring up that may damage my testimony or me as a witness. And sometimes they may say, well, no, we're not going to bring the defendant up because there's too many things the prosecutor could bring up that could weaken the perception of the case. And it's the same thing, I think, if you're an apologist and you're arguing for the resurrection, you got to make a decision. Are you going to bring in something like the Gospels? Because as soon as you do that, well, then that opens up the skeptic to bring in some other objections. So if you follow that line of reasoning, that's why I prefer, when I'm arguing this with a skeptic, I prefer the minimal facts approach. But if a person wants to spend the extra time and go with the maximal approach, well, that's fine. That's just up to them. This is my preference. It's kind of like the same between the evidentialist versus the presuppositionalist view. If you want to do it, just go ahead. I don't want to argue over methodology. I've got my own, and I feel comfortable with it, and that's what I'm going to do. If you want to do something different, by all means, go for it.
Awesome. All right. So turning it to you, Robert, just sort of quickly give your take on these various approaches, minimal facts approach and that sort of thing. What do you think about that?
I mean, for exactly the same reasons Mike espoused. I'm a huge fan of the minimal facts. I actually talk about it as a part of my own epistemology, as far as what I call like kind of a black swan epistemology, which would take us far afield. But it's just the basic idea that we should start with the most sure stuff and then gradually tiptoe out from there, which is exactly what the minimal facts is. So I really like it. And this conversation is just always so complicated and so hard to find common ground with a skeptic anyway. The minimal facts is like obviously the best way forward for that. And then you can add on as appropriate corroborating stuff like Lydia McGrew and like the undesigned coincidences and all this cool stuff that like add to this fuller picture of like, whoa, there's something to this. But like, I always start with the minimal facts myself for the same reasons.
Awesome. All right. And Caleb, I know you mentioned, I think in your book, you mentioned about 5 different approaches. So I'm interested in what's your take about the different approaches to the.
Yeah, so the approach that I like the best would be probably what a moderate facts approach, which is a combination or a middle ground. I don't go general gospel reliability, and I also don't go nearly as minimal as Mike would. So it would be probably closest to William Lane Craig's approach of the burial, empty tomb appearances and origin. I also really like N.T. Wright's approach, which is incorporated into that of the trying to find the origins of Christianity and acknowledging why was this belief so different than anything around and why would they come to believe that. And it seems to me, in my opinion, that like any methodology that doesn't incorporate that sense of origins is going to be not nearly sufficient. That's just my opinion, but I don't think you can completely rule out an explanation for the missing body and for the appearances without going to naturalistic hypothesis. But I think adding in that origins approach really makes that more difficult. So that's typically the idea that I like. I also I'm not against the maximal facts approach per se that the McGrews and Jonathan McLatchy and others would do, but I also don't really find it overly persuasive because not only do you have to argue a lot more data, but I think even if it were to be granted that the Gospels were generally reliable, people would still be skeptical of the more outrageous claims, right? I mean, we can still see that in history when Tacitus tells us that a bunch of people saw a phoenix, or when Josephus says that before the fall of Jerusalem that a cow gave birth to a lamb, right? Even then, we probably wouldn't believe them. So I could see someone making that same argument with the Gospels of even if they are generally reliable, we still wouldn't believe them with supernatural claims. And of course, that goes back to the worldview and biases, but that's just kind of how I see it.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So with that said, let's get into that. What is this evidence that we're talking about? And I think that the first thing we need to establish is, okay, if we're approaching the resurrection historically as responsible historians, what are the historical sources of information that we can get data from? So, I'll turn it straight to you there, Mike. What do you think are the main sources that are relevant to establishing the case for the Jesus resurrection?
Well, of course, there's the Gospels, right? We can look at the Gospels because they are our earliest biographies of Jesus. We have 4 biographies of Jesus, written within a generation or so of his lifetime, and are rooted in eyewitness testimony. We can talk about discrepancies. We can talk about how reliable and who wrote the Gospels. Those are different matters, but at least within, probably 70 years, no more than 70 years, you got 4 Gospels, biographies of Jesus, all of which mention the resurrection of Jesus. And at least you probably have at least 2 independent accounts there, John and Mark, if not more. So then even better in my view would be the letters of Paul. The undisputed letters of Paul. And in fact, you only need a few of those, like Galatians and 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians, to come up with the fact that they were claiming Jesus rose from the dead. That is, Paul and the apostles who had walked with Jesus. They were claiming Jesus had risen from the dead and that it was something that occurred to his corpse. It was a bodily resurrection. I think we can make the argument for that. So, and then you've got, of course, within Paul's letters, especially 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, you've got some oral tradition, oral formulas, at least one, perhaps 2, that go back very early and for which the Jerusalem apostles would agree if they perhaps had it formulated in Jerusalem themselves, where it talks about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus and the appearances to individuals and to groups. And I mean, this is huge. And Paul says this is what the apostles are preaching, not only himself, but also the Jerusalem apostles, those who had known Jesus. So we get back to very early through Paul's letters and the oral tradition in them, to the fact that the apostles in Jerusalem, those who had walked with Jesus, were claiming that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. They really believed this, and that the nature of the appearances were such that they believed that Jesus had inaugurated the general resurrection, and that he had been raised bodily in nature. I think that's pretty strong. Now, of course, there's some other evidence that we can throw in there as well, but I think those are our best sources. Oh, and we can add the sermon summaries and Acts, I suppose, because most New Testament scholars would agree that those sermons, though not transcripts of what Peter and Paul and Stephen and others had said at that time, they do summarize the apostolic kerygma, the formal and official apostolic preaching of that time. So that's pretty cool stuff.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. I believe it or not, Mike, I just did a show I think about a couple months ago with Gary Habermas, specifically analyzing these earliest sources, these oral traditions and that sort of thing. So yeah, that went really well. So I think at this point, just because to save time, I'll just open it up very quickly to either Robert or Caleb, rather than giving your case, because I take it you guys would agree with everything Mike said about the historical sources. Do you guys have any follow-up questions about the historical sources for Mike to respond to?
Follow-up questions?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to make the point of he brought up the Acts sermons, which he beat me to it. But I was going to say Acts 10:41 has the disciples eating and drinking with Jesus. So I think that's a pretty early indication of the physicality of the appearances, even if one is to not trust the Gospels. And I would personally argue that Matthew 28 is a very primitive tradition, and I'm working on a publication right now to argue that. So, but I think that the sources Mike said were all great. 1 Corinthians 15 is, the pinnacle of resurrection tradition. So.
All right, cool.
I have a question of, Mike, do you happen to know like our earliest fragment of 1 Corinthians 15? Like how far back manuscript wise can we go on that?
I've got a couple books on my shelves. Perhaps the most recent one would be by Kruger and Hill, about the oldest manuscripts, oldest New Testament manuscripts published by Oxford University Press, Charles Hill and Michael Kruger. And if I remember correctly, the oldest manuscript that includes 1 Corinthians 15 goes back to about the year 200.
So the reason why I bring that up is there's a certain gap between, I think, the academy and lay people, both on the Christian side, but especially the skeptic side, where it seems like most scholars, like take someone like Gert Ludemann, who is like, a expert in the resurrection himself. He doesn't, or Bart Ehrman, they don't seem to question that Paul really wrote 1 Corinthians 15 and that we need to take it seriously. But the average internet skeptic is going to look at what you just said, or, listen to what you just said and say, what 200, what happened between 50 AD and 200 AD? And I was just wondering if you can verbalize why scholars, that doesn't bother them.
A fantastic question, actually. I think we can admit that we don't really have any, if that's our earliest manuscript of 1 Corinthians, then we don't have anything earlier than that. And we have to look at least at the possibility that Paul didn't write that and it was later added, or that it was corrupted somehow. That's a possibility. But then we look and we say, okay, let's apply this principle, to other sources of that period. Let's apply it to Plutarch. Let's apply it to Suetonius and Tacitus and Sallust and Livy and others of that period. I've got a book on my shelf, and I think it's called Text and Transmission. It's also published by Oxford University Press. It's dated around 1985. It's actually around $400 if you want to purchase it. So it's one of those kind of books that Oxford publishes that's mainly for libraries. So I've got that on my shelf. I didn't pay that amount for it. They were very kind. Since I was one of their authors, they sent it to me when I requested it for free. But you look at that, and it gives all the manuscripts that are used in critical Latin text for the Roman literature, the Latin Roman classics. And there are, I think it's like 99 different authors in that ancient Greco-Roman period. So let's just call it 100. We'll round it up to 100 from 99, okay? And it's now we're talking about the critical Latin text. So that would be like, we talk about there being about 5,500, 5,000. I think 5,000 is what Dan Wallace would say, maybe a little bit more, of manuscripts. A lot of them recently have been found that they're duplicates, or they were counted twice. So there's just over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And they go from the earliest, the John Rylands one, from that little fragment about the size of a credit card from John's Gospel, all the way up to, like the 16th century or something like that. And a lot of those, of course, aren't even going to be used for the critical New Testament text that we have today, the Nestle Aland text, that is behind translations, our English translations today. So there might be, maybe 400 manuscripts or something like that that are used for the basis of our critical Greek text of the New Testament. Well, for our critical Latin texts, for these 100 Latin texts in antiquity, there's a total of about 1,700 manuscripts. And although there are a few fragments, like there's one little fragment for Plutarch's Lives that's written within 100 years of the autographs. Generally speaking, aside from just a few rare fragments, almost all of the manuscripts used for critical Latin text are dated from the 9th to 16th centuries. Hundreds and hundreds of years, even as much as a millennium when you get back to, something like the writings of Cicero or something like that, Sallust. Well, close to a millennium, but, 9th to 16th century of which these critical Latin texts are based. And it's like for Tacitus, I think the earliest source is one document from the 11th century. And I think that's about it for what we have for Tacitus. It's not much more than that, I can tell you that, for his Annals of Rome. So if you're going to say that we can't trust 1 Corinthians 15 because the earliest manuscript we have for it was written 150 years after the originals, well, then you might as well throw out all ancient literature. Now, some people will go to that extreme and say, yep, you can't trust any of it. Well, that's up to them if they want to do that. I just think that they're being uber skeptical in that kind of sense because now they're forced into a corner. That's not to say that we can have absolute confidence that what we read in Tacitus, Suetonius, Plutarch, etc., is exactly what they wrote. There are still a lot of places where we, textual criticism, we just don't know what exactly they wrote. But, we have classicists still believe they have a fair amount of confidence that the critical texts we have today are fair representations of what the original said.
Awesome. All right.
That's very helpful. And I want to emphasize for the listener too, that this is a debate that I don't hear academics have, just to emphasize, the most serious skeptics, the most stringent skeptics who are scholars seem to all take 1 Corinthians 15 seriously, but it's just an interesting question of okay, how do you answer, the internet skeptic who's questioning that? But that was very helpful, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks. And I do want to add that for practical purposes, I think we need to keep in mind that when we are talking to skeptics on the internet, okay, they really haven't thought through a lot of this stuff. And, we can bring these things to their attention, but just don't get bogged down in conversations like that, because a lot of them are just wanting to argue for argument's sake. And there's no reason why you need to waste your time on that. We come to our own conclusions. Everyone is left with the responsibility of making their own conclusion. And if they want to be uber skeptical, that's up to them. We don't have to feel obligated to be in their camp and to be as skeptical as that.
Awesome. All right. So I do want to move on to the next topic, but Caleb, I know that you wanted to get into the historical sources with Matthew 28 and that sort of thing. So what I would say, since Mike has a time limit, and I want to make sure we cover everything with him before he has to go, maybe if you and Robert would be willing to stick around after Mike has to go, we could get back into it and you guys can give your take. But is that okay?
That's absolutely fine with me.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, we'll focus primarily on Mike, and I'll just have you guys ask questions. So with Mike, with the next section here, okay, great. We've established what our historical sources are that are relevant to this question. But I wanted to get from you, what do you think are the necessary historical facts that we can get out of those sources that help us establish the case for the resurrection?
Yeah, well, when I go into these in my book, of course, my large book on the resurrection, and it'd be things such as Jesus' death by crucifixion, that is virtually undisputed by historians of Jesus today. In fact, you even have people like Bart Ehrman and John Dominic Crossan and Garrett Luneman, saying it's one of the most certain facts of the ancient world that Jesus died by crucifixion. So, you've got that. Something that is acknowledged by virtually all historians who study the subject, again, including atheists, agnostics, Jewish, whatever, is that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. And the way we get to that is you look and you say, well, we've got ample evidence that they were making the claims. We talked about that a moment ago with 1 Corinthians 15. You can look at Galatians chapter 1, Galatians chapter 2, where Paul says he goes up to Jerusalem and they certified, he spent 15 days with Peter and Hysteresi, he got a history, an accounting of the life of Jesus. And then 14 years later, he goes up and he runs the gospel message past them that he was preaching to make sure he's preaching the same message. And they verify that he's preaching the same. And we can look at Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who are likely disciples of the apostles Peter and John, respectively. And we see that they speak in a very laudatory manner of Paul and place him on par and with Peter, and refer to Paul's writings as part of the sacred scriptures. So we can, since Paul is dead when they're both writing this, we can I think we can safely infer from that Paul was preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles in terms of the essentials, at least. We can't prove that he agreed with them on everything, but at least with the essentials, I think we can infer from that. And so if Paul's preaching the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the deity of Jesus, well, they were too, because these are essential things about Jesus. So we've got Jesus's they're preaching his death, burial, resurrection, the appearances to individuals and to groups. Now, scholars will disagree on whether they were proclaiming the bodily resurrection of Jesus, the physicality of the corpse that had been raised. I think the evidence for it is overwhelming, but it doesn't enjoy a majority of scholars. So at least they are claiming that Jesus appeared to them. And most scholars do think that he appeared to them. They believed that he appeared to them in group settings. That's not all scholars, but most, probably 75 to 85%. The rest of them is nearly 100%. Another 100% fact would be the conversion of Paul, the skeptic, because he had an experience he was convinced was of the risen Jesus who appeared to him. Why is it more than Paul and the disciples just claiming that they actually believed it as well? Because we have numerous ancient sources that report that these disciples were willing to suffer continuously and even willing to die. Though we can't verify all of them died as martyrs, we can verify that several of them did. And if you see your colleague martyred for preaching a certain message, and you go right out after that preaching the same message, that shows your willingness to be martyred. even if you're never martyred. But we have good evidence that they were imprisoned, that they were persecuted for their faith, and at least several of them died as Christian martyrs for their gospel proclamation, which would have included the resurrection. So, and Paul, his own eyewitness testimony, talks about all the sufferings and imprisonments and beatings and threats of death on a daily basis that he experienced because of his gospel proclamation, and history reports that he was eventually martyred for that proclamation. So it shows that they were not only proclaiming, they actually believed what they were proclaiming, because liars make poor martyrs. So in summary, you've got Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly after a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. That's by virtually 100%. And then 75 to 85% would acknowledge that some of the experiences occurred in group settings. And rightly so, because the evidence we have for the group appearances are every bit as good as if not better than what we have for the individual appearances. So if you're going to accept the one, why not the other? And then you've got the appearance to Paul, and that he converted based on an experience he believed or interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. Those would be facts that are virtually undisputed today.
So just as sort of a follow-up question for you, Mike, and Robert, for your benefit, because you're down getting a package. So just because Mike's time is limited, I'm just going to focus on him, and you guys can ask questions. But then if you and Caleb's already agreed, if you want to stay afterwards, then I can go back and interview you guys on some of the other questions and get your takes on that.
Sounds good.
Perfect. So, all right. So Mike, I have a follow-up question for you about these historical facts with the appearances. Do you think that it's possible to get any specific details about the nature of the appearances, apart from the fact that it's individual and groups, or is that, no, that's the minimal facts, that's what we can get?
Yeah, that's very difficult. It depends how far we want to go with that. Now, if we wanted, I think first of all, I think if we want to be really careful and go with the strongest data way of looking at this, we go from Paul's letters, okay? And Paul certainly believes in the resurrection of the corpse. We see this in 1 Corinthians 15. We see it in Romans chapter 8, like verse 11. He says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. It's the mortal body to which life is going to be given. And then in verse 23, he talks about the redemption of our bodies at the general resurrection. So it's a bodily, physical thing. Then you come to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. He says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope about those who have died as believers in Christ. He says, because when Christ returns, he's going to bring back with him those who have died as believers. Okay, so he's bringing back with him. Now, what's he bringing back with him? Well, both my mom and dad died. My mom died in 2013, my dad a year later. If I were to go to their graves today, I would see their corpses. Their corpses would still be there. The skeletal remains would still be there. But Paul makes a statement, he says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, 2 Corinthians 5:8. You've got in Philippians chapter 1, where he talks about while being in prison, he could die and be with Christ, for that is very much better, he says, or he can remain on in the flesh, which is more necessary for the benefit of the Philippians. So he sees that if he dies, he's going to be with Christ immediately. The spirit leaves the body and goes to be with Christ. So when Paul is talking about he's going to bring back, Jesus will bring back with him those who were believers, he's talking about the spirits of those believers. And then he says the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. What are they going to be? What's raised? Because he's bringing back the dead in Christ with them. So what's being raised? It's the physical corpse, which is then reunited with the spirit. It's a bodily, physical resurrection. And in 1 Corinthians 15, when verse 20, he says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. And in verse 23, he says, each in his own order, Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So the way we are going to be raised is the way Jesus was raised. Paul argues, in essence, in reverse order. We're going to be raised bodily, and that was that's going to be the general resurrection. Jesus was the beginning of the general resurrection, therefore he was raised bodily. So Paul believes in a bodily resurrection, and therefore the Jerusalem apostles who verified his gospel preaching believe in bodily resurrection. So I think from Paul, we can get a very strong case that they were proclaiming the bodily resurrection of Jesus without even visiting the empty tomb or the Gospels. Now, you can go to the Gospels, and of course, there you've got an empty tomb. You have Jesus, as Robert talked about, being touched. He's eating. That's in Acts, but it's also in Luke. It's also in John. You have Matthew, where the two Marys grab Jesus's feet. So you've got Jesus being handled. He eats. He converses with him. This is a bodily resurrection. And again, you could argue for some independent testimony from the Gospels themselves. I think you could add that, and that would be good. But even just from Paul's writings, you get the nature of the resurrection being bodily, although he doesn't talk much in specifics about what those appearances were like.
Awesome.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that Paul in 1 Corinthians, I think it's 15:3-4, does he imply the empty tomb when he says that he was buried and he was raised? Because that certainly would seem like if something's buried and raised bodily, that if you asked him, was the tomb empty, he probably would have said yes, obviously.
Yeah, Caleb, I do think that probably implies a bodily resurrection. But it's one of those things that I think it's weakly implied. There are some things that are so strongly implied, you could say it's explicit, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a scale on which these things are. And that's one of those things that, yes, I believe it's implied, but, and what does it mean when it says he was resurrected? The Gnostics later used that in the Gospel of Thomas. There's two Logia in Thomas, 37 and 51, that talk about the resurrection as disembodiment and enlightenment. Now, that's later, of course. It's probably the middle to late 2nd century that is occurring. But if the Gnostics could change it, so could the Christians if they had wanted to. So the question is, did they do that? And so just by saying resurrection, this is where I might part from N.T. Wright. I think you could say that the evidence that he gives shows that the burden of proof rests on the one who wants to argue that they did not mean bodily resurrection. But I think that's as far as you can go with it. I don't think that argues that they necessarily meant resurrection. So, yeah, the short answer is he was buried, he was raised. Yeah, I think that implies it. But I don't know how strongly implied it is.
Yeah, well, one thing I think of I know James Dunn makes this point is why, if this was the most important creed, right, this is like of most importance, why even mention the burial at all? Because it doesn't even mention Pilate or crucifixion, right? Why was the burial so important if the body just got discarded somewhere? Who would care what happened to the body? So I think the fact that they would even bother mentioning the burial is perhaps because both an empty tomb and appearances convince them of resurrection. If it was just appearances, what the burial is irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point by Dunn and that you're making there. Again, these are things that you can look at. They're inferences, and they have different weight to them. They have different weight to them. Some people, view this creed as like an outline of it's used as an outline for the story. And so, yeah, if he's buried, well, tell us more about the burial story.
Yeah. And in Acts 13, you see there's a similar of died, buried, raised, and appeared. And Acts 13 it says he was buried in a tomb and was raised, which is basically what Paul says. And obviously the author of Acts, Luke, thought there was an empty tomb because he mentions it in Luke. So I think that we know that Luke at least meant to imply an empty tomb in Acts, and that is a very similar structure to Paul, means that those creeds were very short summaries, as you just said. So I would agree.
Awesome. All right. So it is 11:10 now, Mike. I did have one last section I wanted to ask you about. Is that okay if we go a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. Awesome. So obviously great. We've got our historical facts that we can establish and that sort of thing. But now the question comes, so what? Let's assess it on an explanatory level. And maybe do you want to speak to, what are some of the ways we can try to explain these facts? And why would positing that God raised Jesus from the dead, or just Jesus rose from the dead as a strict historian, why would that be the best explanation compared to other naturalistic theories?
Sure. Well, I like using arguments of inference to the best explanation. Historians use some different ways. I like McCullough's method. It's a clearly articulated one, more so than you usually see by historians out there. They do use different things, but I think McCullough probably does it better than anyone else. In his book, he's got one from the 1980s, Justifying Historical Descriptions, and then one from the first decade, I think the first decade of the 21st century, called The Logic of History. And so he lays out these criteria of inference to the best explanation. You got things such as, and these are just common sense stuff, explanatory scope. So, you've got all these facts that are accepted, that virtually everyone accepts because the data is strong. So you want to be able to account for these facts. If a hypothesis can't accommodate some of these facts, then why not? Why not? It probably needs to go back to the drawing bin, or to be revised, or to be just discarded altogether. Then you've got explanatory power. Given the truth of the hypothesis, what do we expect, and do we get what we expect? So, like if the hypothesis is that Jesus' disciples hallucinated, what do we expect? Well, based on what we know about hallucinations, we don't expect groups to be saying that they saw Jesus and really believe it, in a sense that they thought he was raised bodily. So we don't expect groups. We don't expect a skeptic like Paul to experience a hallucination of Jesus being raised from the dead, because Paul isn't grieving over Jesus' death. He's glad Jesus was dead. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected or wanted to see. And hallucinations and research in hallucinations over the last century informs us that only about 7% of those hallucinating hallucinate a visual hallucination. So some will think they hear something, but it's not there, or they touch something, or are touched something by something that's not there, or they smell or taste something that's not there. But only 7% actually see something that is not actually there. Yet in the case of the disciples, you've got 100% of them claiming that the risen Jesus appeared to them. That's visual in nature. So we don't get what we expect. So it lacks explanatory power. With the resurrection hypothesis, we get exactly what we would expect if Jesus actually rose from the dead. People seeing him, and in group settings, skeptics coming to faith and converting, like Paul, and even to a lesser extent James, because the risen Jesus had appeared to them. Now they knew that he was who he claimed to be. So we get what we expect. You've got with explanatory scope, does it account for all the things like, all these things? The resurrection hypothesis does that better than everything else. It's less ad hoc. In other words, it requires fewer non-evidenced assumptions, or we could say speculations, than others. And plausibility, that's a difficult one. You could say the hallucination hypothesis is plausible to an extent because people do grieve when a loved one dies. And especially we might expect it in the case of Jesus, given who they thought he was and the sudden violent death that he experienced. But we don't expect hallucinations in group appearances. We don't expect 100% of them. We don't expect Paul to convert him, so that's the explanatory power that it lacks. But plausibility, I guess the plausibility of a group hallucination is very low, if nil. When it comes to the resurrection hypothesis, you would have to determine ahead of time whether God exists and whether he wanted to raise Jesus. Now, if you assume God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then the resurrection hypothesis becomes extremely plausible. But as a historian, purely as a historian, we can't know those things ahead of time. So I would just say the resurrection hypothesis is to an extent inscrutable. You might want to go a little further and say, well, it's plausible insofar as Jesus claimed, you can argue that Jesus claimed to be God's special agent, chosen to usher in his kingdom, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that both he and his followers claimed and believed were divine miracles and exorcisms. These two facts are things that are granted by virtually 100% of scholars. And so you could say, well, based on that, that forms some background knowledge that might make a resurrection plausible. But I don't know that how you want to go with that. Anyway, the resurrection hypothesis is far more plausible, or I should say, it fulfills the criteria of inference to the best explanation far better than any competing hypotheses when you subject them to these 4 criteria.
Awesome. All right. So just as the last little bit here, I want to turn it to Robert and Caleb to see if they have any follow-up questions, not comments, but questions for Mike about this explanatory thesis. And I'll start with you, Robert, because I don't think you've spoken in a bit. So.
I'll just throw out one thing that came up briefly in the Richard Carrier debate that I thought was interesting. I think you might have touched on it during the debate, but he brought up, so mass hallucination is a really interesting key point in all this, group hallucination. And Carrier brought up specifically cargo cults experiencing like mass hallucinations. He also said shaker cults. That's maybe a little different, but like cargo cults is pretty interesting. It made me want to look that up. And I was curious for your thoughts on that sort of comparison.
No, it's a good question. Yeah, I haven't really looked at those. What I have looked is the literature written by mental health professionals, and the research that has been done for over a century on hallucinations gives us some good understanding on what a hallucination actually is. It is a false perception of reality. We are perceiving something that isn't really there. So it differs from an illusion, like an optical illusion when you're riding in a car on a sunny day and we see the sun reflecting on the road ahead and it looks like water. That's an optical illusion. That is a distorted perception of reality. And then you have a delusion. A delusion isn't necessarily a false perception. A delusion is when you persist in believing something despite conclusive evidence to the contrary. So I go back to the Church of Venus, the Applewhite Cult, back in the 90s when the Hale-Bopp comet was here. The Hale-Bopp comet, and they were, Applewhite was saying that it was a spaceship, that the apocalypse had come, the spaceship was here to rescue people and to take us to another galaxy called heaven, which is heaven. And his followers would have to commit suicide to get picked up. Well, astronomers were saying that's not a spaceship by the comet, it is Mars. So you've got all this decisive evidence to the contrary of what Applewhite was proclaiming, but they persisted in their beliefs. They were deluded, and it cost them their lives. So that's different from a hallucination. So I don't know about the experiences of the cargo cults that Carrier raises, but if we're thinking about hallucinations, they are like dreams. They are false perceptions of reality. You're perceiving something that isn't there. It's just going on in your head. And so it's like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night, tell her I'm having this dream where I'm in Hawaii, and if she goes back to sleep, invite her to join me in my dream so we can have a free vacation. That can't happen. We might have individual dreams about being in Hawaii, but we're not in the same dream. It's not the same dream. And it's the same thing about hallucinations. You cannot join another person in the same hallucination. And so that's our understanding of hallucinations. So we'd have to look at these cargo cults and their experiences and define them, examine the claims to see what else that could be other than a hallucination.
Awesome. All right. And Caleb, you get the honor of asking the last question to Mike.
Awesome. Robert asked one of them, but the other one I was going to ask is, I know that Mike has written I forget which journal it was, about Jesus's resurrection predictions, and he believes that those are historical. And he also mentioned him performing miracles and doing stuff like that. Could someone not argue that that would create expectation for them to see Jesus if he told them he was going to rise from the dead, and they believed he was miraculous and all that stuff? Obviously, that wouldn't apply to Paul, but I could see someone imagining that if Jesus said he was going to die and resurrect, and he died, and the disciples were waiting there, grieving, and like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I can see Jesus or some way. Is there any way that could happen?
Yeah, sure that could happen. I would just point out, though, that even if they were expecting Jesus in that sense, it wouldn't explain the group appearances. You still have to explain that somehow, and hallucinations doesn't work. You would have to explain the appearance to Paul and his conversion. You could throw in the appearance to James, which is, for those scholars, and there are only about 30 of them who really discuss it, unfortunately, but of those who do, there's 90% or so that would say that James converted based on an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And that he was a skeptic prior to that time. Just like you got Gospel of Mark saying that Jesus' brothers thought he was beside himself. You got John chapter 7 saying that not even his brothers believed in him. You've got John 19, when Jesus dies, he entrusts the care of his mother to the beloved disciple. Well, why not James or any of his brothers if they were disciples? That's who it would typically go to, but apparently they weren't believers even at that time. So why is it that afterward they're with they're with the disciples in the upper room when Pentecost happens? Well, it's probably because what we find in that oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, then he appeared to James. And you got the appearance of Paul, of course. And then if you want, you could go right to the Gospels and apply the criterion of embarrassment here and say, look, we've got in all of the Gospels there, well, Mark doesn't really give us much information, but in Matthew and in Luke and in John, they don't believe based on an empty tomb. It's like, well, none of them are expecting the resurrection. And that creates a problem. Well, Jesus did predict it, as the evidence suggests. Why aren't they expecting it? So you can choose your poison there. Do you go with and reject the Gospels and then eliminate that? But typically, skeptics are going to want to focus on that and saying Jesus didn't predict it. But I do think we've got answers for that.
All right, thanks.
Awesome. So Mike, I'm so sorry, but Caleb's question did raise a quick question with me, and I promise, if you don't mind, just very quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that, but so I do take your vindication argument or resurrection prediction argument seriously. I actually have an idea that we can use this as double warrant. So if you can prove that the resurrection happened, as we've been discussing, the fact that we can prove, and Jesus also predicted that ahead of time, that's almost double. You can count that as double warrant, because we have not only the resurrection itself, the miraculous event, but we also have this prediction of a miraculous event that happened. So I'm just sort of curious, do you think that there could perhaps be some double warrant? We've not just got one miracle, but two miracles, so to speak. Just sort of curious on your take of that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dale. There was a book I contributed to about the historical Jesus published by Brill a few years ago. The general editor of it is Jan van der Vaart, who was my doctoral supervisor, my doctor fodder. And so it was about the historical Jesus. And my essay in that book was, it argued, I took a courageous step here and said, I think we can argue you start historical Jesus research with the resurrection. Now, some don't want to do that, of course. They'll say, well, that's crazy. Why would you start with the resurrection of Jesus? And I'd say you start with the resurrection of Jesus and work out from there, because if Jesus rose, well, we do have really good evidence that he predicted his death and resurrection. So that lends credibility even more to the historicity or authenticity of those predictions. And then we've got good evidence for his miracles. Well, if he rose from the dead, that gives even more credibility to those miracles being divine miracles and exorcisms and things like that. So if you start with the resurrection of Jesus and work out, you can get some other things involved in there. So I think that's where you were going, and I think we can go there, though many would say that's an audacious approach.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. So Mike, as promised, I'm going to let you head off because I know that you're on a strict time there. But before you go, I just, as the host, I want to say thank you so much for not only doing me the favor of coming on the show and coming on the podcast and that sort of thing, but for all your help, during my research phase. You, Gary Habermas, and Tony Costa are great examples of, you put your money where your mouth is and you help people that are sincerely seeking. So I just wanted to say thank you as on a personal level, as a friend, that, I appreciate everything you do.
Well, thanks, Dale. Thanks for what you're doing. And of course, Gary and Tony are just wonderful people and great people. And hey, Caleb and Robert, wonderful dialoguing with you guys during this as well. Thanks for having me on, Dale. Appreciate it.
Awesome,
Thanks, Mike.
All right, take care. All right, and yeah, so Caleb and Robert, obviously I'll save my thanks to you guys till the end of the show, but yeah, we can continue on and sort of go back over anything that you guys want to discuss that you guys didn't get to give your takes on. So, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna ask. I was gonna want to press some more on the group hallucination thing, but I know we didn't have time. But I liked Robert's question, and the ones that I give in mind, because I personally don't find that overly persuasive, because I think there are occasions, you can call them illusions instead of hallucinations, but there are plenty of cases someone could point to where several people thought that they were seeing the same thing. Marian apparitions like Fatima, where I think it was a couple thousand people stared at the sun and they thought they could see the heavens moving. There's the Mormon Witnesses, right, with Joseph Smith. 3 of them thought they saw an angel. The one I always give is what's not nearly as well known is in the 1800s in Britain, there was a mass hysteria of what was called Spring Hill Jack. It was like this madman, but a woman reported that she was attacked she reported to the police that she was attacked by a man who could jump super high, breathe fire, and clawed her. And that got reported in the newspaper. And then everyone started saying they could see him, that he was attacking them. And it was a mass hysteria, so much so that the mayor of London actually had to call a state of emergency because of it. And so most people now think it was just a psychological thing. But I could see someone arguing that there was a lot of, I could see someone making that parallel to early Christianity and saying that, look, once Peter said, guys, I saw Jesus, everyone was just praying and oh, wait, I think I saw Jesus too, and stuff like that. And even there's one photograph from Argentina of a cloud that kind of looks like Jesus. And I remember someone saying maybe that was the appearance of the 500. A bunch of people looked out and saw that. And Josephus mentions that during the fall of Jerusalem, that a bunch of, and he's like, this is crazy, but I'm only reporting this because witnesses saw it. He said in the clouds, there was a bunch of soldiers and stuff running around, and angels and all that stuff. So I could see someone arguing that those are cases where several people have claimed, whether it was an illusion or confusion of expectation, that they could see the same thing. So I would have asked him more about that, but I know he didn't have time. So that's personally why I don't use that as an argument against hallucination, because I personally don't think that would suffice against that. But yeah, that was just my take on it.
Let me ask this. So in terms of the issue of expectation, and Caleb, from reading your book, I know that you're already familiar with this argument, but I'd be interested in getting your take and Robert's on this. But so there's the Jake O'Connell type argument where we can say, but actually this argues against the hallucination thesis, because hallucinations, according to the medical experts and that sort of thing that Mike and I personally have interacted with, they say that it has to be consistent with your prior expectations. But Jesus appeared non-gloriously, and we know from Second Temple Judaism, they had expectations that the resurrection body would be glorious. There's examples of shining and that sort of thing. So this is something that I've turned into an argument or an angle that, well, if we've had groups of people or multiple people, it doesn't even have to be simultaneous for this argument to work. I don't even care about arguing for group appearances in this argument. But we've had multiple people where they're seeing a non-glorious appearance of Jesus. He's close up, he's recognizable. So those are the details I think are important.
Well, he's not recognizable in many of the Gospels, but I mean, most of them say they didn't recognize him originally, but that's a side note.
Right. But he was recognizable with certain appearances. So I think he would have had to have been recognizable for the apostles. And then after that, you can get cases of illusion or something like that. But yeah, anyways, I'll turn it to you guys. what do you guys make of the fact that Jesus' appearances, as described, contradict the Jewish expectations of what a resurrection body should be? Do you think there's any merit there?
Robert, do you want to go take that?
Sure. Well, yeah, I've definitely heard Dale. People, scholars say, probably N.T. Wright in particular, that it is very different, his description, than like shining like the star in Daniel 7 sort of thing. I don't think it ever says the resurrected Jesus like glowed or shone. I don't think, which
Paul is the only example, I think, where, because in Acts you have the light that he's blinded. So I think he's the only example of that. Yeah.
That's true.
But that's after the ascension. So,
yeah.
So it's not,
true.
Yeah.
True. So yeah, no, I think that is a great point. Like you said, it's like this, and this goes back to the whole minimal facts versus other facts. Like you get these minimal bedrock pieces, but then you have these other things that are very plausible. Like maybe they're not 99% or whatever, but like they add these angles, as you said, Dale, of like, okay, so Jesus didn't seem to be different than expectation of what the glorious resurrected body would be or something. Seemed kind of surprising. Another one I would add to that is the emphasis on the third day. Like, why do they care so much about specifically the third day? And funnily enough, if I were a skeptic, I might actually make recourse to an empty tomb to explain the third day, because you need to explain. I guess my point is, like, if it was this very nebulous visionary thing, clouds and whatever, it seems odd that they would be focused on that he was raised on the third day. It would be more like this ascended into heaven sort of thing. And so if I were a skeptic, I might say, well, maybe they did find an empty tomb on the third day, but his body was stolen. So you can see how, once again, you're adding this other little angle that, sure, it's not the most important piece of the puzzle that they emphasize the third day, but I'm pretty sure that's considered pretty bedrock, that they, the followers of Jesus immediately shifted not only to talking about the third day, but to worshiping on Sunday, which is a huge change to their culture. So obviously something about that Sunday, like Resurrection Sunday, was huge for some reason, and so yeah, once again, it adds just this other angle that when you put on the lens of it actually happening, it fits really well. And it becomes just a little bit more awkward for the skeptic to like find recourse to explain.
Awesome.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Dale.
No, go ahead, Caleb. I'll let you, because I asked you guys.
No, I was looking for one of the quotes. It's funny because I actually found a quote from Richard Carrier saying something about the luminosity. He said, if the body was glowing, for example, this would surely have been remarked upon. He's talking about the gospel narratives. Yeah, I think that's interesting that he kind of agrees that. Now he has a weird, his explanation is they want to present Jesus as physical, and so glowing would take away from that. And then I'm like, I don't think that's true, because first of all, Carrier has this really weird notion of the spiritual body. I'm sure you all know this, that Paul thinks that Jesus swapped bodies and all this nonsense.
Wow.
His exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15 is just terrible. But putting that aside, I think the idea that they didn't see him glowing, and of course you have to go to the gospel narratives for this. But that's, typically the argument is Paul equates his appearances with the 12. Paul saw a vision, therefore the 12 must have also saw a vision. And I think one way is, first of all, Paul doesn't say how they saw it. He only says they did. And the bigger argument I would use against that is the glorious argument, is the fact that the gospel narratives, at least on that detail, are probably correct, because surely every reason would be to preserve it and to make it's better apologetically. In the Transfiguration, they see Jesus glorious. In Revelations 1, John's vision, Jesus is glorious. When Stephen looks up at the clouds and is being stoned, Jesus is glorious. Like it's not as if they didn't want to show Jesus as glorious, as if that would be too much for them. Like they clearly didn't mind. And there's nothing that makes a glorious body not a physical body. Moses in, I forget if it's Exodus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, is glowing with God's radiance. And even Daniel 9, Daniel 12, which Robert was saying, where it says they'll shine like a star, is clearly talking about physical bodies. And Jesus himself actually says this. And this is one of the arguments I use for Matthew 28, actually. Earlier he says the righteous will shine like the sun. But in Matthew, he's so mundane, even more than Luke and John, because at least Luke and John, he can vanish, he can change his form, he can levitate, he can walk through doors. In Matthew, he's just a normal looking guy. Like there's no relevance whatsoever. And it's a very weird detail. And it seems even to me more primitive than Paul, who thought of a spiritual body in Luke and John, and the addition to Mark and the Gospel of Peter. So that's just a very strange detail to make Jesus look completely mundane and not have him shining like an angel.
Didn't he also shine during the transfiguration earlier in the gospel?
Yeah.
So it would seem very natural. Wouldn't he shine even more in his resurrection?
And right. And they worship him too. Yeah, exactly. And in Matthew, they go down and worship him. And it's like, wouldn't that make sense to have a worship being look heavenly? And it also says some doubted, but unlike Luke and John, Matthew never relieves those. It just says some doubted and it moves on the Great Commission. It never has him, oh, touch me, oh, look at this. If you wanted to get rid of the doubts, why not just have him, shine right then to show that he really was real? The fact that it mentions the doubts but doesn't even try to reduce those is certainly historical. I mean, that's just such a weird thing to throw in if you're trying to convince people. Because if they doubted and they actually saw him, how much more would Christians who didn't see him doubt? So I think all of that has a historical core to me.
Interesting.
I think what's...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Dale.
Oh, no problem. I was just going to say quickly, you mentioned the transfiguration. Well, I have seen some skeptics, just to represent the other side, and I want to get you guys' take. They say, well, actually, the transfiguration is a resurrection appearance, and it's just misplaced. What do you guys think about that?
That comes from Robinson in the 80s, I think.
Yeah.
He says that. And actually, William Lane Craig published an article in, I forget which journal it was, refuting that. And Gerald Collins also has a really good article. And I think that's a pretty fringe view now. And he did that for that exact reason, because he's like, this is really weird. The Gospels don't have a luminous appearance. Maybe the transfiguration was the appearance to Peter and Mark just misplaced it. But that's become fringe now because there's no good evidence for it. So.
Awesome. Yeah, Robert, I interrupted you, so go ahead. What did you?
No problem. I was going to say that one of the more remarkable things I learned during my own studies of this stuff was when it was probably William Lane Craig who first introduced me to this, but the fact that up until the resurrection narratives, there are a lot of Old Testament proof texts, allusions to past narratives of the story of God and his people and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden you get to the resurrection and it just becomes like stark and like no comparisons to future followers and what their persecution, like none of the Gospels have Jesus say, since I was raised, you'll be raised. That's Paul later who says that. Jesus doesn't say that, and not only that, but the resurrection stories are just like kind of weird, almost as if a group of people are trying to figure out what the heck is going on here, versus a literary creation. Like with like if you're going to create this, then you're probably going to make him glowing. You're going to make allusions to the Old Testament. You're going to put encouraging statements to the church in there. And like none of that is there. Instead, it almost seems like what people wrote down who were still kind of confused about it all, and how Jesus was both physical and also walking, appearing in a locked room. Like there is a sort of disorderedness to it that comes from simply experiencing weirdness and writing it down. And I love that aspect.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Robert. Actually, can I share my screen real fast? Because I had a whole slide about this where I was talking about, oh, that's not it. Hold on. On here.
Dale Glover. You are associated with Dale Glover? I don't know about that. I don't like that guy. Took a couple seconds to register it.
Yeah, no. So this is what I was saying with the Matthew, and I bring this up because not only the luminous point we mentioned, but Robert brought up the lack of Old Testament citations, and that's one of the. I also just realized I misspelled illusion in this slide, but it's okay. It should be with an A. But I think there's non-Matthean vocabulary, which is a separate argument. The ascension is never mentioned. It's mentioned in Luke. It's mentioned in the addition to Mark. It's mentioned in the Gospel of Peter. It's implied in John when Mary hugs him and he says, "Don't grab me because I've not ascended to the Father yet." Matthew never mentions it, and Paul does mention the ascension. So it's very weird that like at the end of Matthew, you're just wondering, so what happened next? Did Jesus just vanish? What did he just walk away? We just don't know. Robert's absolutely right. There's no Old Testament citations. Even in Luke and John, you get very broad ones of the scriptures. They don't cite a specific text. And that's weird for Matthew, because Matthew of all the Gospels loves to do this because he's the most Jewish. So he's constantly referring back to the scriptures, right? And so it's very weird that he didn't do this at all. And even in earlier in Matthew, he talks about Jonah, right? So just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man will be. And that's not even called back to in the last chapter. So it's very weird. I think the gospel message is also very mundane, because he talked about the Great Commission. He says, go and spread the gospel, baptize people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But he never actually says what the gospel is, right? Paul correlates it with with will be resurrected. Luke mentions forgiveness of sins. John mentions eternal life. But Matthew doesn't actually say what the gospel is. He just says, go spread the gospel. So it's very weird that he didn't elaborate on what exactly was meant by it and the significance of that. And we already said mundane appearance of the resurrection body. And the last one I had was the resurrection appearance to the women. Matthew's the first one, is the earliest source to mention that. And that's very unlikely to be something added in later, as opposed to earlier. Because I think, as a lot of the viewers, and I'm sure you all know, that the testimony of women was generally not considered best in that culture. And it would be quite embarrassing to have a woman be the first one to see Mary, especially since before this, in 1 Corinthians 15 and in Mark 16, it was Peter who was supposed to have the first appearance. So to switch out Peter for Mary is quite a significant thing, I think. It is, and the other gospel authors later on, Luke and John, add men to the empty tomb narratives, I think, to offset that a little bit, to say, oh, look, they went and checked those, so you don't have to. And in Gospel of Peter, they don't even, they have an entire Jewish crowd get in front of the empty tomb, and then the stone rolls away, and everyone sees Jesus ascend to heaven. It's like the most apologetic thing ever. And then the women come and have no role whatsoever. So I think you can see, as time went on, they try to get rid of the women more and more and more. And Paul doesn't mention them. So I think that's not something you just would want to add to a narrative. So I think Matthew 28 is primitive for all of those reasons. But
that's funny. Yeah, the fact that you bring up the women, because I think someone that we all know, my old skeptical co-host David Johnson, he says this is the worst argument ever in the history of resurrection research, and he basically denies the criterion of embarrassment itself as being a valid way of adjudicating stuff, because he says we as moderns have no way of telling what is truly embarrassing or not. So yeah, I just wanted to maybe turn it to you guys. Do you think that the criteria of historicity are in general are a valid way of adjudicating these facts? Are there any problems with them and that sort of thing? Maybe I'll start with Robert on this one.
I definitely think they're valid. I mean, I am not an expert. I like I said, I enjoy these topics and collecting and trying to organize and sometimes form like a sort of a meta map of like where people agree, disagree. But I'm not a scholar. So, but from what I understand, these sort of criteria are used by people across the board. So it seems obvious that in general, the criteria are valid. When it comes to like the embarrassment and some of the ways it's used, like in the gospel, I become kind of agnostic about it, because I do get the point by someone like Richard Carrier that it can be a trope to, for instance, have the followers of the hero doubt or something. And so we have to be careful of using that, of like, because that's sort of the embarrassment of like, well, they doubted, so they must have not believed and they must have been convinced. But you can also see how that could be a tactic from a literary standpoint of that they, this, it sets up this grand reveal where they no longer doubt or whatever. And I'm sensitive to the idea that maybe Matthew or one of the gospel writers wanted to like, it's part of the story of Jesus, of how he elevated, the outcasts of society and women. And so maybe that's a perfect literary thing. But I don't want to throw it out either, because I still think it's striking that it's women at the tomb, especially since like Caleb said that when you go to 1 Corinthians 15, when it becomes a creed, they go straight to the hard hitters of like Peter, and the disciples. And so that discrepancy actually gives me a little bit more credibility to me for it, that you have the women at the tomb. It does become a little bit more of an odd feature that seems maybe more likely to have happened. But yeah, I do agree. I mean, it seems like I don't know if you guys would agree with this. It seems like the criteria of embarrassment particularly is the one people come after and worry about how it's used. I think it's ridiculous just to throw it out, because I think there's clear cases where I think the burden of proof needs to fall on the other person. If something seems to be clearly embarrassing to reveal, it becomes on the other side to say how, surprisingly, that was actually a strategy to do that. So like having Jesus say that he doesn't know when he will return. I think like the Jesus Seminar, the most liberal scholars, I think all say that that's a legitimate saying of Jesus because of its kind of embarrassing quality, that is surprising that Jesus would admit something that he doesn't know. So that seems like we need to allow perfectly valid usages of it, even though it's up for more debate than the other criteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dale, did you ever see my debate with David Johnson on the resurrection?
I did, yeah, on Quora, right?
Yeah, and he brought this point up exactly, and I didn't have, because it was a team debate, I didn't have much time to respond to his answer, and I probably would have changed it a little bit now than I would have then. But when he said the criterion of embarrassment is only used in New Testament studies, that actually is not true. I didn't know that at the time. I looked it up, and it's used, for example, with Josephus, because Josephus has a very Jewish bias. And there was one scholar who said whenever Josephus says something that makes the Jews look bad, that's probably historical. So that's basically the criterion of embarrassment and other interesting. So that's just, I think, a catchphrase people use, but it's not true. And secondly, I think the point I said earlier is that when you say we don't know what would be embarrassing, I just think that's not true. And when you look at the other things, like how Christians seem to be embarrassed and how enemies used it against them, right? So not only did Christians try to add them into the story later and Paul take them out, but then you have in the 2nd century Celsus, he denies it because he said that a half-frantic woman saw Jesus and deceived the others. He talked about Mary Magdalene. And even in the 1700s and 1800s, with German criticism, they called them womanly fables and women who had minds to form chimeras and phantoms and all of this stuff. So I think the fact that literally it was being used against them for the longest time is an argument against the resurrection, and the fact that Christians, as time went on, were putting less emphasis on it. I think all of that shows that it was embarrassing and that it seemed like it would have been a problem for them.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you guys were saying. You guys said it better than I could. So yeah, I do think that, we have positive reason to know that this was embarrassing, that sort of thing. Especially so I know that Caleb brings this up in terms of it's usually uses evidence just for the empty tomb, but we also have to remember this context that they're also the first to receive the gospel message. And
yes, exactly.
This is what makes it really embarrassing for your main central message. So that I got this from Gary Habermas responding to Bart Ehrman and stuff. And the central gospel message is being delivered to women first. That trumps any, the least, skeptics will say that, well, Mark is trying to say that the least are first and that sort of thing in the kingdom of heaven. But the central gospel message concern, the fact that would be embarrassing, that trumps any lesser concerns or motivations that skeptics want to do. So yeah, I just wanted to add that theological angle is really important in establishing this embarrassment case.
Yeah, Richard Bauckham has a good thing on that, because he talks about how, I think it was Philo tells a story about Moses' family before he was born. Miriam has a vision that she's going to have a brother, and she tells her parents. They don't believe her. Then Josephus tells the story later on, but he switches out Miriam for Moses' dad, and he is believed. So the idea of like, oh, we don't want a woman receiving this kind of divine revelation. And he talks about another story where a man and his wife, the wife receives message from an angel, and he gets mad at God for saying, why didn't you give it to me? Why did you have to give it to her? So I think it's interesting to see, like what you were saying, Dale, is that the idea of giving a theological message to a woman. And some people point to John 4, where the Samaritan woman goes out and says, Jesus is the Messiah is here, and it says she is believed. But if you read on from that, it says, we now no longer believe because of what you said. We believe because we saw it for ourselves. So they had to go verify it. And earlier in that chapter, it also says the disciples were surprised that he was talking to a Samaritan woman. So I think all those subtleties imply that was still questionable. So yeah, I think people can pick. I think most of the examples people pick to show that it wasn't are actually self-refuting. Like Carrier will say, oh, Josephus used women witnesses. What he doesn't tell you is that's because they were the only witnesses left alive after a giant slaughter. There were literally no male witnesses alive. So if that's the only time he uses women witnesses, or when there are no male witnesses, I think only helps the point of what we were saying, is that preferably, if you're going to invent a story, why not just have male witnesses there? Why do you have to go to so much effort to have to make it a lot more risky on your part?
That does bring up something I've heard skeptics say, which is it would be women to go to the tomb to apply spices or whatever. So I think I've heard that before. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, that's just not true. Actually, and I cite this in the thing. There's a Jewish tractate that says, for the body of a woman has prepared. For the body of a man, it can be a man or a woman. And in Mark, Joseph of Arimathea is the one who prepares the body, not the women. The women just stand there and watch. He's actually the one to wrap it up and everything. So you could have had the disciples come back, or Joseph or somebody, or you could have just done the Gospel of Peter, where a huge crowd just gathers and sees it. So I think that's quite a bad argument.
Let me ask you another one, Caleb and Dale too. Why is it normal to go back to a body to reapply burial spices? That's something else people have brought up recently, I've heard.
So do you want to answer that, Dale, or do you want me to?
I'll let you go first, and I'll provide my take, because I think I can give a unique take.
So I have a different view than some people would, and it's going to depend on how you see the burial. So somebody like Craig would argue that Joseph of Arimathea honorably buried Jesus. I would actually take Byron McCain's view, and maybe Craig Evans' view, that I think Jesus was actually dishonorably buried as a criminal in a tomb, not thrown in a pit with the crucified, the Romans, not that Jewish criminals were buried dishonorably in tombs away from their family. And he gives a couple arguments for this, because if you look at the Jewish Mishnah, which is a little bit older, but it has older traditions, it dates later, but it has older traditions, and a lot of them seem to apply in the gospel narratives. They could not be buried in their family tomb. Jesus isn't. They could not be mourned or wept by their family. Never mentions that in the Gospels. And I think another fact that I think is interesting is that Mark never says it was Joseph's tomb. The other Gospels do. But just for going historically, that Mark's the earliest. It also never says that the women helped Joseph. They just watched, which I thought was a little strange detail of why aren't the women cooperating with Joseph. And the fact that the tomb happens to be near the execution site, I also would wonder why a Sanhedrin member would have a family tomb near where dead criminals are executed. It's
So
a dishonorable
you don't
place.
think he was buried by Joseph?
No, I do. I think he was buried, but I think he was buried dishonorably. So no mourning.
Not
as a
in
criminal.
Joseph's tomb.
Not in his family tomb, but in a tomb, yes.
Okay.
But so I think the women are then coming to anoint him to give him some honor, to try to lessen the shame, and that's so that would be my explanation. But I think that actually helps, because, and what I point to is that in that tradition of when they would bury criminals dishonorably in Judaism, they would have to go back after a year and collect the bones and then give them to the family. So they would be punished for a year. They atone for their sins when they're dead, give them to their family. So then I say, and Dale Allison makes this point of, like, if he was in there and the body decomposed after a year, the family would still have to come revisit and bury the bones. So the body would still have to be identifiable after a year, and people would have to come to the tomb. So I think that's actually a very positive argument for the tomb being empty, is that eventually someone would have to go check, and it would be very surprising that they could manage to do that and also believe in the empty tomb. So I think that's helpful. But I know it's a long answer to your question. So yeah, my answer is that I think personally they were trying to give more honor to the body because it was dishonorably buried in a tomb. But that's just how I would say it.
So that's interesting. I actually think there could be some truth to what Caleb is saying. And the thing that's unique to me, that I wanted to bring in the evidence from the Shroud of Turin, because I am convinced that this provides some good evidence for the truth of Christianity. And basically what I think the best evidence, some people debate about, okay, was the body obviously was not just thrown in the tomb unwashed or without any preparation, because that's not how the blood stains come across. So there was some kind of washing, but it was obviously not a full washing, because there are blood stains. So I do think.
So real quick, weren't they in a hurry as well because it was Passover? Does that play into this?
It does. Yeah, exactly. That was the answer I give. Is they were in a hurry to get the body in, and that sort of thing. So they could only do partial washing and partial rituals. So they would have to come back. But the shroud could also fit Caleb's model of the dishonorable burial. So, Joseph just did like a half-witted partial washing, and okay, that's good enough for you. or something like that. So yeah, but that's sort of my unique thing is I would factor in the shroud evidence that, well, the shroud man was only partially washed, and this indicates either they were in a rush and they didn't do it properly, or perhaps the dishonorable thesis that Caleb gives.
It does say he was wrapped, so I think this you could still be wrapped in dishonorable burial. It does say that in Mark, so there's nothing. It just would mean that they wouldn't get spices, it wouldn't get to more. Because typically, in Judaism, there would be, if you died, they would have your funeral. That they would walk the streets, have people playing music, kind of like New Orleans funerals, if you've seen those. And then they would have 7 days of mourning, like at the house, at the tomb. So all of that's not allowed when you're a dishonorable criminal who is killed for breaking God's law. You can mourn at your own house. You can mourn quietly among yourselves, but you cannot make open lamentation. You can't be buried with your family, at least for the year. So that I think is why, and I don't know how that pertains to the shroud because I'm not an expert on that. I think it's an interesting topic, but I also think it's so controversial that I typically stay away from it. One thing I do say, though, that I think doesn't get mentioned a lot with the resurrection, and hopefully if I won't write a whole nother book on it, but I was wanting to do a book with several chapters and each person contributes to a chapter, kind of like a, different compilations of it. And I was wanting to do a chapter on visions of Jesus today. And I think that's a really interesting idea because kind of when you go with Paul and the, the enemy attestation, there's so many, I don't know how much you've looked into, there are so many stories of Muslims who have never heard of Jesus, who have dreams and visions. And often these will be veridical where he'll give them a Bible verse. They'll wake up, they'll find someone they know is a Christian and say, hey, I had this really vivid dream and he said this to me, and they'll open it was like this verse. And these are usually in countries where Bibles are illegal, like, Saudi Arabia, Iran, very, very closed countries, and it convicts them. And there was actually a New Testament scholar who was Jewish, I think Hugh Montefiore, who also converted because before he was a New Testament scholar, he converted, and he said he didn't know anything about Jesus before then. So I think the idea that that there are so many people who have never heard or don't want to hear of Jesus having visions is very interesting. And it's a little bit similar to Paul, but I kind of use it against Richard Carrier's thing because he says, why didn't Jesus just appear to everybody? And why is Paul our only convert? And I want to say, first of all, how do we know he doesn't still appear to people? And Paul might not be their first convert. There are other enemies as well. So I kind of try to use that against them. But I think if we take that factor, the resurrection is more probable if we look at that evidence of if there's still people who should, for against all expectation, are hallucinating this person they've never seen, and they're all seeing the same person and are able to say information they don't have. Is that not pretty convicting evidence? Is that not more probable if Jesus was raised from the dead than it would be if they're all just happening to have the same hallucination? So, yeah.
I love the, specifically the book Dreams and Visions by Tom Doyle. I don't know if you're referring to that one.
Yeah, I need to get it, actually. It's on my list. Yeah.
It's fantastic. It, honestly, for Christians especially, is one of the most faith-building things. And I mean, for skeptics too, it's not like a research book, with all these hard citations, but it's still really powerful stuff. And I think it's a stroke against the idea that all these things are in accordance with our starting cultural expectations, because these things, and like you said, they're often veridical too, where someone will have a dream about a person wearing a certain shirt, and then they'll be in the marketplace and see that person, be like, you were in my dream. And then,
right, yeah.
And then they'll be like, yeah, I was supposed to tell you about Jesus today. And it's just like, crazy stuff like that. And that seem to go against cultural expectation too, which I like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's another thing I would, I don't know if I would say disagree with Mike on, but when he talked about the resurrection predictions, I don't see that. I take Wright's argument that I don't think they would have expected a resurrection at all. I think they would have thought Jesus was a ghost, or at most ascended into heaven. Like, why would they believe he was bodily raised from the dead, which no Jew believed at that point? And that's part of the reason is that some people say, well, Jesus predicted his own resurrection. It also says they didn't believe or didn't understand it. But I think one of the reasons I have against that is because if they believed because they had a vision and he predicted his resurrection, shouldn't they also have believed in the second coming? Because Jesus also predicted that more than he predicted his resurrection. And if they had a heavenly vision of Jesus, wouldn't that convince them that the Son of Man had been coming on the clouds of heaven like he predicted, right? Why not say the second coming has already happened? No, they still thought that was in the future. Oh, he hasn't come back yet. He will. Well, if he hasn't come back yet and that's in the future, why is the resurrection now and not in the future then? Why? Because, Paul says the second coming and the resurrection of all of us happens at the same time. So why not say, oh, Jesus is in heaven now and he's waiting to be resurrected at his second coming, instead of saying, oh, he was already resurrected, but he hasn't come back yet. It just seems weird to have to split those two up and not say that they happened at the same time, when assumption and seeing him as a ghost would have been much better explanations for that.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
Mike actually does kind of address that when he go, in his book, he does go over the 6 arguments for, the 3 arguments against, and even he says, even if you don't want to say, okay, it's a resurrection prediction, at the very least, at minimum, it's a vindication prediction. We can prove that, and that's very established. And so,
yeah. I think they would have thought he was talking about the end times, is what I think that. And when and they say that, he says, I thought Elijah has to come back first. And when he says that in John with Mary, he's like, oh, Lazarus will be raised from the dead. She's like, oh yes, Lord, I know he'll be raised from the dead at the end of the days. That's what you would think if someone said, I will be raised from the dead. They didn't think he meant now, literally. So
that's so I do sort of agree with you on that, Caleb, because that's how it makes sense as to how they, answering the skeptical objection. Well, they didn't expect it. They didn't understand Jesus was predicting his resurrection. And I think it is because they more understood these predictions as vindication predictions in some sense. So, yeah.
Right, yeah.
All right.
I think a skeptic might try to maybe combine a little bit of what you said, Caleb, and say, yes, the second coming is natural. They just thought Jesus' resurrection was the very beginning edge of the second coming, and it was all about to happen within 20 or 30 years. But then it just didn't happen. They might try to do some recourse.
Yeah, but then I would say, why did they say the resurrection happened now and not the second coming? If they're gonna take the leap to say, oh, he's already been resurrected, why wouldn't a vision be proof that he had returned, like he said? Because I mean, when he predicts a second coming, it's very heavenly imagery, right? You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. If it was something like the Transfiguration, wouldn't that prove that he had come back? And if you're going to say no, then why? No, it's going to be a future event. Then why wasn't the resurrection a future event like every other Jew thought it was? So it seems weird to separate those two. If they're going to say, oh, he's resurrected because we just saw him, why not also say he returned? If you're going to put that to the future, why not put the resurrection to the future? So I think separating them is just very ad hoc. I don't see how the logic would follow at all, if that makes sense.
So I have a question for you guys that I'm interested in. It's one I asked David Russell too, and I usually ask other Christians and that sort of thing. But so there is different approaches to studying the resurrection. So some people say, like for myself, I broke up all of the various facts individually and then looked at them in explanatory isolation, like trying to see, can we prove the resurrection from any single fact by itself? And then after that, then you can look at a cumulative case, all the facts put together and that sort of thing. And on my end, part of my reason for thinking the resurrection is true is that I can come up with equally possible naturalistic explanations for every single historical fact in isolation, except for the appearance of the 12. So that one, I think, we can make a thing just off that fact alone. And then obviously have the cumulative. But yeah, what do you guys think? Does it only work on a cumulative level, or are there some isolated facts that can establish the resurrection on their own? What do you guys think on that?
Robert, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I definitely think there's always going to be this constant zooming in, zooming out, looking at one piece, looking at the whole, looking at another piece, looking at the whole. I mean, that's just like how reasoning works with complex data. I don't know if there's one piece that does all the work. For me, what just sort of hits me more is probably Paul more than anyone else. It's like, yes, I can listen to someone like Richard Carrier talk about this guilt complex and all this stuff, but I feel like I'm putting effort into making myself see it with that lens when it takes effort. And especially if there's anything to James being a skeptic, which, I mean, it seems like there's at least something to that. So if that's even, somewhat plausible, then solving Paul only gets you half the way to solving the skeptics, who converted because of the resurrection appearances. And so, I just feel like I'm putting in this effort Paul still is the most striking one, because the naturalistic hypotheses of, visionary expectations or something for the people who already believed, you can start to get me there. I still feel like I'm putting effort into fitting that model onto the data, but I understand that. It's like these are very religiously ecstatic people who are grieving. One of my kind of online friends is really into the whole cognitive dissonance theory with this, that can spark something like the data we see or whatever. And it's like, okay, I feel like I'm putting some effort, but I can kind of get there. When you add in Paul, it's like, okay, this just got a lot more complicated. Now I got to explain Paul too. And then any possibility of the empty tomb as well adds in some more effort. And so for me, it is cumulative in the end, for sure. Like it's when I feel like I'm having to put in effort in each thing to make it fit. And then you zoom out and you realize you're having to put effort in every single place. But some are definitely stronger than me. And Paul is the one that is so striking. And it's not just that he converted. It's just when you read his writings and who he was and what he was about and the change in his life and his heart for this person, Jesus, who he may have never even met. And it's that whole package for me is probably the most striking.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of cumulative. Just a personal anecdote. Yeah, I really tried with Paul in isolation. I think I tried approaching it from 3 different arguments and angles and that sort of thing. In the end, I didn't think it worked on my end in isolation. But Paul's significance to me is that he really helps establish the historical facts and that sort of thing about the appearances. That for me, that's sort of what the relevance comes more at the factual level rather than the explanatory level. And that, Gary Habermas, if you're listening, that's your fault. You talked me out of it. But yeah, Caleb, what's your take about the individualistic versus cumulative case?
So yeah, I might disagree a little bit with Robert here. I don't really like the argument that, well, we have to add more fact. It's the Occam's razor thing, right? Of the simplest explanation is the best. The resurrection explains all of these things. Therefore, I mean, that is true to an extent, but I can also see them saying that we have at least some examples of, let's say that if 10% of bodies that went missing were resurrected and 10% of people who were seen after they died were actually resurrected, that's obviously too high, but just pretend that is for the case. Even then, the probability of a body going missing for other reasons and the probability of people seeing dead people for other reasons is still higher than the resurrection hypothesis. And Dale Allison makes a good point of saying that one could say this with Mormonism, right? He could say, well, look, Joseph Smith showed physical plates to people. People also saw an angel with non-physical plates and they were willing to die. Joseph being a prophet explains all these better. Whereas if you take the other hypothesis, Joseph had to fake the plates, then people had to hallucinate. And then, so they could say it's just more complicated. So I don't know. I don't think I don't personally find that persuasive for that reason. I think I think for the empty tomb, the only 2 arguments that I think are okay are that, well, you implied it earlier, Dale, when you said it was rushed. So I've read some people who think that Joseph was just temporarily burying Jesus because of Passover, and then later on he went and actually buried him somewhere else. I don't think that really works because Joseph could just point out, oh, guys, I just moved him over here. And the only other one that's really weird, but it's very implausible, but it's not impossible, was Carrier's idea that necromancers who practice witchcraft would steal body parts and use them for spells. And since Jesus was thought of a miracle worker, they went in and stole his body, which is very ad hoc because there's no evidence that was a thing in Jerusalem. But like, is it impossible? Is it unlikely? I don't know. So, and same with Paul. I think it's I don't think we can psychoanalyze people from 2,000 years ago. We can barely do it today. So diagnosing him with he had guilt complex or he was a schizophrenic is all just really irresponsible, and you can't do it historically. But we can't disprove it. So we could remain agnostic and say, here's a possible solution. So I don't think it's possible that of Ludemann's idea that Paul could be guilty. I don't think it's likely. We don't have evidence for it. But so that's personally why I like the origins approach of right, because I think that even if we grant all of that, it still wouldn't explain all of the data. So I don't think cumulative arguments are bad per se. But I think you still have to, I do think we have good reason to believe the appearances were bodily and that there was an empty tomb. And I don't think even granting group hallucinations and a stolen body, you can get to all the facts. Or you could just do what Calvin does and say that Jesus had a twin brother who moved the body. And he's like, that explains it. He did just as well. And I know
So you're talking about the beliefs of the early church, like how they ended up with the beliefs that they had, kind of?
Yes. Right. Yeah. The beliefs like, the non-glorious body and that he had been resurrected instead of ascended or a ghost. Right. I think that the hypothesis that I make in my book is that the only explanatory power would be that if there was an empty tomb and if there were bodily appearances, because any other combination, if there was just an empty tomb, they would say the body was missing. If there was just appearances, they'd say, oh, he's a ghost. His body's still there. If there was an empty tomb in visions, they would say God took him up to heaven, like Elijah or Moses. And there were some examples that happened to people after they died as well. And so the only way you get around that is if you have both bodily appearances and an empty tomb. And so then the question is, what best explains that? And then, you can conjecture resurrection or the swoon theory or a twin, which is weird that the swoon theory actually, I think, has better explanatory power than the hallucination theory, but it's also much more implausible. I've read maybe 2 people defend it recently, but it's so I hardly any, almost all of them do hallucinations of some kind, right? You don't see very many go to swoon theory. There was actually one guy who did a combination theory. He said that the body, Jesus swooned, and so they moved his body and he died later on. The disciples hallucinated, and Mary also confused the gardener with Jesus. So like all these different hypotheses threw together, it's very ad hoc, but it's like, wow, you're just getting, and Paul hallucinated. Very weird, like a quilt kind of different theories.
Yeah, well, you have, that's the only way it'll work. You do have to do a combination. If you're going to go naturalistic route, you have to do a combination theory and different explanations to explain all the facts, because you can't just have one explanation that fits all and that sort of thing. So
what's a really creative, I don't think I've heard anyone defend this, but I've heard it mentioned, is that one time someone, I think in 1800s, argued that the earthquake in Matthew 27, when he dies on the cross, that opened up a crevice and the body of Jesus fell in, and then aftershocks broke it up, and so that's why it was. But like, are you saying people couldn't notice that in the tomb, that it would have been split open? Like, come on, like they wouldn't have noticed that. Like that's a very out there, and they're going to grant the historicity of the earthquake, but not the other stuff. Like, it's just very ad hoc. Yeah.
I want to say one thing about the Mormonism comparison, though. Mike Lacona might be gone right now, but I'm going to channel him for a second, because in his debate that I watched last night with Richard Carrier, that came up, and he brought up how 8 out of 11, I believe, of the people who said they saw the golden tablets or whatever recanted later.
Yeah.
It's very debatable how much they were persecuted for their beliefs in the same way that like Christians were. And also, I think they said that they never saw actual physical tablets. It was like a visionary experience of tablets. Mm-hmm. So I just, there are some major differences to the resurrection story.
There's a good video that covers all of that too. They have quotes Mormons will use as saying, they said, we did touch it. And later on they asked, like they have interviews where they asked them, did you actually touch it with your hands? They said, no, we didn't touch it with our actual hands. It was a bit, so I think that's a good point. Actually, another interesting thing with Mormonism is it's actually the opposite of Paul, because what's her name? Lucy Harris, right? She said she saw the angel Moroni, but then later on she betrayed Joseph Smith because she took 116 pages of the Book of Mormon and hid them, and he couldn't reproduce them and made him look like a fraud. Oh, but that happened after her appearance. So it's the reverse. She became an enemy after her appearance. So her appearance apparently didn't convict her that much. You think if an angel did it, you'd believe them, but I guess it wasn't that strong enough to convict her. So it's the opposite of Paul. So I would just say all of those. And we also have, the Book of Abraham and all these things that show Joseph was just a con artist. He was in jail before he did the Book of Mormon for being a con artist. So it's not the best thing he was selling rocks to people saying that could help them find treasure. So it was quite a scammy thing to do. So that's why I think Mormon apologetics and Muslim apologetics are especially bad. Muslim apologetics are bad because most of them come from countries where they are not even allowed to hear opposition. Yeah. And so they just say, and that's the unfortunate truth. Shabir Ali's pretty good because he lives in the West. But if you hear a lot of these like Zakir Naik and all these god-awful arguments that are just like, really?
Yeah.
There was one that William Lane Craig was watching, I think with David Wood. I forget his name, but he was arguing that the Catholic Church existed 300 years before Jesus during Alexander the Great.
What?
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, what? When did that ever happen? No scholars ever thought that.
So, believe it or not, is you mentioned Shabir Ali. I will confess this. Please don't disrespect me, guys. But there was a time for a couple months where I was actually thinking Islam was true, based on working with Shabir Ali. He's in Toronto, so
he's a very smart guy. He's a good debater.
He is. Yeah, I was sort of the numerical patterns in the Quran kind of. At face value, when you first hear it, there were some patterns where I was kind of thinking there might be something to this, but then I sort of approached it through Dembski's criteria, specify complexity, and realized they haven't proven anything. Like they, for example, complexity, they'll give you basic probabilities. Oh, there's a probability of this, but then they won't account for, well, how many specificational resources do you have?
Right.
There's so many specifications, and especially when it gets more compound. So yeah, that fell apart. But there was a time when I was actually for a couple months saying, yeah, I think Islam might be true because of that. So yeah, Shabir's a persuasive guy.
Yeah, I think a lot of the arguments I notice are when they try to say, oh, here's scientific facts in the Quran, and they'll say things like the heavens stretch open, and it's like, oh, our universe is expanding. And Hugh Ross does this too for Christianity, and I would disagree with him. That I don't think you can read the text like that. And it's almost like Nostradamus, where it's like the great city will be on fire, and people are like, oh, 9/11, New York City was. It's like you can't read that into the text of like when it's very broad things like that. I just don't think.
Is that concordism, right? I think where you read.
I think so. Yeah. There's a term for it, which is why there's some very specific. The prophecies in Daniel and especially Isaiah, because Isaiah actually names King Cyrus will be the one. He names him, are great prophecies. The only issue is that because they're so specific, most scholars think they were written after the fact. And so you would have to make a case for them being predating that, which I think can be made. But if you can make that case, I think you have a solid idea of prophecy because they're very specific. But you're going to get a lot of scholarly contention because most of them will say, oh, it was written way after that happened, and that's how they knew that.
Awesome. All right.
Same with predictions of the destruction of the temple. Like that automatically makes liberal scholars, understandably, they feel their hands are tied. That automatically means that text was written after the temple's destruction, but that presupposes that prophecy can't happen, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, even Josephus talks about another, I think Jesus ben Ananias, who in 66 AD was prophesying the temple was going to be destroyed, and that no one takes that as being not historical. So
interesting.
It's really not that surprising that someone named Jesus could predict the temple would be destroyed. So, I mean, that takes away from the power of the prophecy, but it also doesn't mean that it's justification for dismissing it.
Right.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that we've covered everything that I can think of. I'll turn it to you guys as the guests. Are there any other topics about the resurrection that you think we haven't discussed yet and you guys really want to go over?
Can we do this again? This was like have a more, this was fun. I know we're all busy and stuff, but we can try to find some time to do this again because this was a nice experience, I think. I just like talking about it in this context. I also need to get Robert White on social media or something like that because he's a smart guy to talk to as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Caleb, I've really enjoyed talking to you too, and I'll have to look up your book on Amazon.
I can just send you a free PDF if you want, so you don't have to pay for it.
No way, man. I'm support.
Okay,
I support people.
That's fine. I'm just trying to help you out.
I really appreciate that.
I did it to Dale, so.
He had to put up with my feedback on it, so yeah.
Yeah, I was asking him for constructive criticism.
Okay, he was doing work for you. No, I do appreciate that offer. But I like. I'm a software engineer. I have a day job, and part of what I try to do with that is like support people who are, doing this more full time. So,
I'm not doing this full time, but
well, I was curious. Are you in school? Do you have a degree in this? Are you pursuing that, or is this purely a hobby? What's your?
It's right now. It's a hobby. I am in school not for that. I'm in school for political science communication.
Oh, cool.
So I don't think, but I mean, I did apply research skills into that, so it's still applicable. But no, I don't have a degree in history. I just thought it was a really interesting topic. I actually did present this at a research conference because for a research conference, we can do whatever we want topic wise. And this was right when COVID happened. So it was an online one, but still it got really good reception and stuff. The Q&A was interesting. So that's what I was looking forward to because it was all these people are doing like cell biology and I'm just here doing this. And so it's pretty interesting. Yeah. Oh shoot. I was going to say something. I forgot what it was going to be. Nope. Lost it. It was a good question though.
Well, I was just going to say, I totally enjoyed this. Dale, thanks for inviting us on to talk with the great Mike Lacona. One thing, obviously we're short on time, so there's so many things we could ask him or say to him. One thing I really appreciate about him is his commitment to truth and accuracy and not towing the line of certain quote unquote orthodoxies, that he wants to get to the truth, and we brought up briefly the controversy over like Matthew 27. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
The saints coming out of the tomb, that some more orthodox Orthodox, not in the Eastern Orthodox, but traditional evangelicals came after him. I think some tried to get him removed from his university post even. And so I really appreciate him doubling down on not giving in to that. And he's so obviously a Christian and supporting the cause too. And so, I don't know if he'll ever hear this, but I really appreciate that about him. And when I was struggling with my faith, that gave me encouragement that he was not simply trying to come out to a certain conclusion, but trying to get to the truth. So I really appreciate that about him.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I thought he was treated so badly with that, and I felt so bad for him with the Norman Geisler and Al Mohler all did such horrible. And Al Mohler is Southern Baptist Seminary, which is in Louisville, which is where I live. So he has a lot of influence. But yeah, I thought Mike was treated so badly, and I also don't like I won't call it a feud, but the little scaffold between Mike and Lydia McGrew. I don't know if you've seen that. I also just I think she's a little. I don't want to disrespect her, but it comes off as a little pretentious of this super yes, absolute inerrancy, everything being reconciled, when I just don't think I'm not against it, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think I wouldn't care as much if they weren't bashing other scholars who didn't take that view. That's really what it is more for me, is I don't care if they have that, but if they're like, oh, you're all just wrong or your methodology is just terrible. I mean, even when I say things like, if I say that Joseph dishonorably buried Jesus, am I implying that the other accounts later on embellish that? It's like maybe a little bit. If I say that Luke and John add men to the tomb later on, does that imply that those are not historical? I'm not saying they are not. I'm just saying if we're going to be honest historically, I think that's a possibility, and that's the argument I would make to a skeptic. Same with the Matthew 28 one, because I had to contrast that with Luke and John and say, look how different these are and how less embellished it is, which I guess could imply that Luke and John are more embellished. So I don't know. Maybe I would fall in that count too of being, I'm not an inerrancy hound. They would probably get on me for that.
Same here.
Yeah, I don't think it matters, and I like that's why I like how Craig does it. If we can, when people try to reconcile the the empty tomb contradictions, for example, I think they can be. I don't really care is my answer. Like, sure, let's grant all of that, but that doesn't make a difference. There are plenty of historical accounts that have contradictions that no one cares, that no one disputes. So I think it's a bad argument, but I also think that when apologists try to give these very long examples, it does come off sometimes as a little ad hoc of explanations, when the simpler I can get is the simpler explanation that they just got it wrong. Like the census of Quirinus, and all the well-known ones. I just don't care enough I'm not saying there is an answer. I just don't take a position, and I'm willing to concede for the sake of argument that, maybe the guard story in Matthew 27-28 isn't historical. Let's just grant that for the sake of argument. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think I can see why it would be very hard to defend that historically. So, but I also think that people who bash others who take that view are just very closed-minded and can't approach it from an honest view, which is why I like how Mike can approach it from an honest view. And that's why I would agree with Robert that I have a lot of respect for him for that reason.
Okay. All right. You guys put me in a bit of a pickle here.
No.
So I'm friends with Tim and Lydia McGrew and Mike Lacona.
They're not going to watch this, are they?
They probably will.
I'm sorry, Lydia. You're a great person, but
no, you're giving your take, and Lydia respects honesty and that sort of thing. So I agree. Mike is committed to the truth, and he follows it even when it's difficult. Obviously, backing up Lydia and that sort of thing. They think what they're doing is right, and they, believe it or not, they're not inerrantists. They're errantists. They believe the Bible has errors, believe it or not.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Oh, I need to look into that. more. Like I'm actually not super familiar with her work, and that's fascinating to me. I want to hear more
That is
about
fascinating.
that.
I would have never, the way
cool.
that it fitted, I would have never guessed that. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually we interviewed Lydia McGrew on Skeptics and Seekers, so I'll give you guys the link to that. You can hear it straight from her horse's mouth. But yeah, I do agree that if you're trying to get someone fired, that's going too far. So I do think that you sin when you do that. Like, come on, we can have some disagreement in academia, and we're all trying our best to serve Christ. So yeah, that's my take on that. Hopefully I didn't, I'm friends with the McGrews, I'm friends with Mike, so I don't want to start.
And Gary, you know Habermas too, right? Because you were on David Russell.
Yeah, Gary, I probably know the best out of everyone. He's been with.
All you need is Craig now, and you'll have the whole set. I know he's hard to get to. I know he's
collect
hard to
all the
book.
cards.
Yes, collect all the cards, the apologetics cards. He's probably the hardest to. I know you already said he's the hardest to book by far, but.
Well, he has very professional standards, and that so I'm a small show. I respect it. Like Mike and Gary know me personally, so they're doing me sort of a favor. So.
Yeah, he doesn't debate people without a PhD, so
yeah.
he doesn't. So it doesn't surprise me his standards would be there. But yeah, I think that's nice. I think it's exciting that there's a new generation of scholars and apologists to take on the mantle, so to speak. And obviously Gary and Mike and Craig and the McGrews have been super influential. You could even say I don't know, say to a lesser extent, but like Strobel and J. Warner Wallace and stuff like that as well. I know they're not scholars in the field, but still, I mean, they definitely had an influence.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, here's my take. I want to thank you guys both for coming on. I feel very, very lucky, very blessed to be meeting you guys. Robert L. White, you've been on the show before, and you're a godsend. I love listening to your shows. I listened to you when you were on Proscenium, I think it's called now, or I can't remember.
Still Unbelievable.
Still Unbelievable. Okay.
Yes.
As well.
And I just realized I should say, I don't think I ever said, my website is robertlwhite.net if anyone wants, to access my podcast or things I've written.
Awesome. Yep. And I'll put links in there as well. And same with you, Caleb. I've seen you in a few shows now from Pora as well. We were on the SNS show on politics. So
yeah, I have a debate coming up on Pora on Tuesday, I think.
Awesome.
So that we'll keep up for that, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah.
Robert, are you on Facebook and social media? I'm trying to, so we can.
I'm on all the things.
Talk. Okay. Are you the one with the profile picture? You're in the sunglasses and the blue shirt?
I think so.
Okay.
Dale can connect us afterwards too if.
Oh, you're good. Dale's not on any of that from my knowledge, so that's why I was.
Yeah,
asking.
I don't even have a cell phone, so. I've never sent a tweet in my life. I have no idea how.
I haven't either, but.
This is my secret theory, but Dale is actually an AI we've been talking to. We've never seen his face. He's not on social media. He is an AI, and you're doing great. You've passed the Turing test, as far as I'm concerned.
That's awesome, yeah.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, thank you so much, guys. Just so the audience knows what I've got coming up on the horizon as an AI. So I've got a few of my professors. Philosophy of Emotions professor, Dr. Michael Lacona. He's going to be coming on sometime in early March to speak about the role of emotions in relation to moral knowledge and a bunch of things like that. We also have Dr. Liz Jackson, who's
I know her.
Yeah, she actually teaches at my universities, and she's actually going to be coming on to debate with the skeptic David Johnson about religious epistemology, as well as Pascal's wager. This is what she specializes in. So that's what we got on the horizon, apart from my cosmological argument, which is a solo series. Have a great week, everybody, and take care.